Hello and welcome to the Sleep Science Channel. You might be listening because the day has finally ended, yet your mind hasn't followed along. The body may feel ready to rest, heavy and still, while thoughts continue to surface on their own. Sometimes they arrive as fragments of the day that hasn't quite settled, sometimes as quiet planning or a vague sense that something is unfinished, even if you can't name what that is. Nothing here is meant to change that. There is no effort required and no expectation that you follow every idea from beginning to end. This is simply a space where explanations unfold slowly, offering something neutral for the mind to rest against or drift away from. The pacing here is intentionally unhurried, and the visuals remain minimal and slow, because the brain responds to change more than content. Fewer shifts mean fewer signals asking for attention. What remains is a steady background, present but undemanding. If you find yourself returning to these quiet explanations over time, you're welcome to subscribe if that feels natural. As we move forward, the focus turns gently toward the brain itself and toward a familiar question. Why, when the world has gone quiet and the body is prepared for rest, does the mind sometimes continue to stay alert? Not as a problem to solve, but as a pattern to understand, calmly and without urgency. When night arrives and external stimulation begins to fade, many people expect sleep to follow naturally. The lights are dimmer, the body is still, the obligations of the day are finished. Yet for a large number of people, this is the moment when the mind becomes most noticeable. Thoughts that were quiet during the day begin to surface. Attention turns inward. The brain seems unwilling to loosen its grip, even when rest feels close. This experience often creates confusion because tiredness is already present. Muscles feel heavy, eyes may want to close, and still the mind continues to move. It may revisit small details from earlier in the day, replay conversations, or drift toward possibilities that have not yet happened. Sometimes there is no clear subject at all, only a sense of mental activity that refuses to settle. From the brain's perspective, this state is not a mistake. The human brain did not develop in environments where quiet automatically meant safety. For much of human history, stillness and darkness required heightened awareness rather than rest. When external input decreased, attention often increased. The brain learned that moments of calm could also be moments when something important needed to be noticed. Although modern environments are very different, the nervous system still carries these older patterns. When the day ends and stimulation drops away, the brain does not always interpret that as permission to sleep. Instead, it may interpret it as a signal to monitor internally. With fewer external demands, internal signals become louder. Memory, emotion, and anticipation move closer to the surface of awareness. During daytime hours, attention is guided by structure. Tasks, sounds, movement, and interaction all provide direction. At night, that structure disappears. The brain, designed to remain responsive, does not automatically power down. It redirects its activity inward, reviewing information, detecting unresolved matters, and maintaining a state of gentle alertness. Research suggests that this inward activity often reflects the brain's attempt to organize experience. Not everything that happens during the day is fully processed in real time. Some impressions are set aside until there is space to revisit them. Nighttime provides that space. In the absence of distraction, unfinished material has more opportunity to appear. This does not mean that the brain is working against rest. It is following a pattern shaped by long-term survival needs. Understanding this can change how wakefulness at night is perceived. Instead of something that has gone wrong, it can be seen as a natural extension of how the brain responds to quiet and uncertainty. Another reason the mind becomes active at night has to do with how the brain handles uncertainty. Throughout the day, many uncertainties are temporarily pushed aside. Decisions are postponed, emotions are contained, questions are left unanswered because there is something else demanding attention. The brain is very good at doing this when external structure is present. It can defer processing as long as there is a reason to stay engaged with the outside world. When that structure disappears in the evening, the postponed material often returns. The brain prefers closure, even small forms of it. An unfinished thought, an unresolved interaction, or a vague concern about the future can register as something that still needs monitoring. At night, with fewer competing signals, these open loops become more noticeable. Not because they have grown stronger, but because there is less noise around them. The brain does not clearly distinguish between physical threats and cognitive ones. From its point of view, anything unresolved represents potential risk. This risk does not always feel dramatic or emotional. Often it appears as simple thinking, planning tomorrow, rehearsing what could have been said differently, imagining outcomes that may never occur. All of this activity serves the same underlying function, keeping awareness online just a little longer. There is also a strong connection between sleep and predictability. The nervous system relies heavily on patterns to decide when it is safe to disengage. Consistent light exposure, familiar routines, and regular timing all act as signals that the environment is stable. When these signals are irregular even slightly, the brain may hesitate. Modern life introduces many small disruptions to these patterns. Artificial light extends the day beyond its natural boundaries. Screens provide stimulation late into the evening. Schedules shift from one day to the next. None of these changes are extreme on their own, but together they can blur the signals the brain uses to judge when rest is appropriate. As a result, the brain may remain in a state that is neither fully alert nor fully asleep. Awareness is lowered but not released. The mind drifts but does not settle. This in-between state can feel frustrating, especially when rest feels necessary. Yet it reflects the brain doing what it does best, responding cautiously when information is incomplete. Another layer influencing nighttime wakefulness involves the body's internal chemistry and how closely it is tied to perception of safety. Hormones that regulate alertness and rest follow rhythms shaped by light, activity, and expectation. During the day, alertness supporting signals rise to help the brain respond quickly. As evening approaches, those signals are meant to decline, making space for rest to occur without resistance. When stress is frequent or prolonged, these rhythms can lose their clarity. Alertness-related signals may remain present into the night, even when the body is physically tired. This does not always feel like stress in the emotional sense. It can feel neutral, like a quiet readiness or a mind that stays lightly engaged without any obvious reason. The brain reads this chemical state as information, interpreting it as a sign that disengaging might still be premature. What makes this especially subtle is that the brain does not require conscious worry to stay awake. Even low-level vigilance is enough. A sense of responsibility, a background concern, or an ongoing adjustment to change can all maintain a gentle alertness that delays sleep. The mind does not need to be racing for this to happen. It only needs to remain slightly attentive. There is also the influence of habit. The brain learns not only from danger, but from repetition. If nights are frequently spent thinking, planning, or reviewing, the brain can begin to associate nighttime with mental activity. Over time, this association strengthens. Evening becomes a cue, not just for rest, but for inward focus. The brain responds accordingly, preparing for reflection rather than release. This does not mean the pattern is fixed or permanent. It simply reflects how adaptable the brain is. It responds to what has been practiced, not to what is intended. Many people intend to rest at night, yet unknowingly train the brain to remain active by consistently engaging with thought during that time. Still, even in these cases, the brain is not acting against the body. It is acting in alignment with what it has learned to expect. Understanding this can soften the experience. Wakefulness at night is not always a sign of imbalance. Often it is a reflection of a brain doing exactly what it has been shaped to do, based on environment, history, and repetition. Another element that quietly shapes nighttime wakefulness is attention itself. During the day, attention is constantly being pulled outward. Sounds, movement, messages, and expectations provide a steady stream of direction. Attention follows what is most immediate. At night, when those pulls fade, attention does not disappear. It simply loses its anchor. Without something external to rest on, it often turns inward, attaching itself to thought, sensation, or memory. The brain is designed to keep attention active. From its point of view, attention equals awareness, and awareness equals readiness. When attention has nowhere to go, it looks for something to hold. This is why even small sensations can become noticeable in bed. A change in breathing, a shift in posture, a distant sound. The mind notices these not because they are important, but because attention is available. This inward attention can also amplify thinking. Thoughts that would pass unnoticed during the day become more prominent at night. The brain does not generate more content. It simply observes it more clearly. This can create the impression that the mind is suddenly busier, when in reality it is simply less distracted. There is a natural tendency to respond to this by trying to control attention, to push thoughts away, or to force the mind into stillness. From the brain's perspective, however, effort itself is a signal. Effort suggests that something matters, that a state needs to be achieved or avoided. This can keep attention engaged, even when the intention is rest. The brain is sensitive to intention, but not always in the way people expect. Wanting sleep strongly can sometimes increase alertness because the brain interprets that desire as a task. Tasks require monitoring. Monitoring requires wakefulness. This does not mean desire is wrong. It simply means the brain responds more easily to permission than to pressure. Over time, many people develop a subtle relationship with nighttime thinking. The bed becomes a place where thoughts are noticed, examined, or followed. The brain learns this association without conscious awareness. When night arrives, it prepares for that familiar inward activity, even if rest is desired. Yet this process remains gentle and reversible. The brain is not rigid. It responds to patterns, not rules. Attention shifts naturally when conditions feel right. Understanding how attention behaves at night can reduce the sense of conflict around sleep. The mind is not misbehaving. It is simply doing what it has learned to do when the world grows quiet. Another influence that often goes unnoticed is how the brain responds to emotional tone rather than specific thoughts. Emotions do not always arrive as clear feelings. Often they appear as subtle shifts in the background, a sense of unease, anticipation, or quiet tension without a clear source. At night, when distractions are minimal, these background signals become easier to detect. The brain is constantly interpreting emotional information to decide how alert it should remain. It does not require a strong emotion to stay engaged. Even mild uncertainty can be enough. A sense that something is unresolved, unfamiliar, or unpredictable can keep the brain lightly awake, maintaining awareness just in case it is needed. This is why people sometimes notice increased wakefulness during periods of change, even when those changes are positive. New responsibilities, altered routines, or upcoming events can all introduce uncertainty. The brain responds by staying slightly more vigilant. It is not reacting to danger, but to novelty. Novelty asks for attention. Memory also plays a role here. The brain is skilled at linking present conditions with past experiences. If previous nights of wakefulness were accompanied by certain emotions, those emotions can return automatically when similar conditions appear. This is not conscious recall. It is pattern recognition. The brain notices familiar cues and prepares the response it learned before. In this way, nighttime wakefulness can become self-reinforcing without intention. The mind notices that it is awake. That noticing creates a subtle emotional response. The emotional response signals relevance. Relevance maintains attention. The process remains quiet but active. It is important to understand that none of this requires deliberate thought. The brain performs these evaluations automatically. Trying to reason with them rarely helps, because they aren't logical decisions. They are assessments based on pattern, prediction, and probability. When seen from this perspective, wakefulness at night becomes less personal. It is not a failure of discipline or relaxation. It is the brain responding to information in the only way it knows how, through careful monitoring of both inner and outer signals. As the night continues, the balance between alertness and rest shifts gradually. Sometimes the shift is noticeable. Sometimes it happens without awareness. The brain does not need to be convinced. It only needs conditions to feel familiar and non-demanding. When that happens, attention loosens naturally, and awareness fades without effort. Another quiet factor involved in nighttime wakefulness is how the brain relates to control. During waking hours, the brain is used to directing attention, making choices, and responding to demands. Control is part of its daily rhythm. At night, sleep requires a different state altogether. One where control gradually loosens without being actively released. The difficulty is that the brain cannot be ordered into this state. Letting go is not a command the brain understands easily. When rest is desired, the instinct is often to manage the process, to check whether sleep is happening yet, or to evaluate how awake the mind still feels. Each of these small acts of monitoring keeps the brain involved. From the brain's point of view, monitoring means relevance. Relevance means attention. Attention keeps awareness present. None of this is intentional resistance. It is simply the brain doing what it has learned to do when something feels important. There is also the influence of identity tied to thinking. Many people spend their days relying heavily on cognitive skills. Planning, problem solving, analyzing, and remembering are rewarded and reinforced. Over time, the brain comes to associate thinking with usefulness and safety. When night arrives and thinking begins to quiet, the brain may hesitate, as if stepping away from something essential. This hesitation is subtle. It does not announce itself. It may feel like gentle curiosity, mild restlessness, or a stream of neutral thoughts with no emotional charge. Yet even neutral thinking keeps the brain engaged just enough to delay deeper rest. The brain also responds to contrast. The sudden absence of stimulation can feel unfamiliar after a day filled with input. Silence, stillness, and darkness remove many cues the brain uses to orient itself. Until it adjusts, it may remain slightly alert, scanning for signals that no longer arrive. This adjustment takes time, and it does not follow a strict schedule. Some nights the transition is quick. Other nights it unfolds slowly. The brain is sensitive to small variations in environment, mood, and expectation, even when those variations are barely noticeable. Understanding this can ease the sense that something is wrong. Sleep is not a switch that fails to flip. It is a gradual change in state that depends on many quiet signals aligning. When alignment takes longer, the brain is not malfunctioning. It is simply waiting, observing, and responding at its own pace. Another aspect that influences whether the brain allows sleep has to do with how it predicts the immediate future. The brain is constantly making quiet forecasts about what might happen next. Most of the time, these predictions remain outside awareness. They guide behavior subtly, shaping readiness without announcing themselves. At night, prediction does not stop. The brain continues to scan for what could require response. If tomorrow feels uncertain, demanding, or unresolved, the brain may stay lightly engaged, preparing in advance. This preparation does not feel dramatic. It often appears as ordinary thinking, gentle planning, or a sense of mental rehearsal. The brain is not worrying in the emotional sense. It is preparing, because preparation has historically increased survival. Even when tomorrow holds nothing objectively threatening, uncertainty alone can be enough. The brain prefers predictability over comfort. Familiar routines, known outcomes, and repeated patterns signal safety. When the future feels vague, the brain compensates by remaining attentive longer than necessary. This is why people sometimes notice that sleep comes more easily on nights before familiar days, and less easily before change. Travel, new responsibilities, altered schedules, or even anticipated conversations can quietly increase alertness. The brain responds not to the importance of the event, but to its unfamiliarity. Another subtle contributor is the relationship between memory and rest. The brain does not store experiences randomly. It organizes them, linking emotions, context, and meaning. Nighttime is one of the periods when this organization becomes more active. Without the pressure of immediate tasks, memory systems can review and adjust how information is stored. This process does not require conscious recall. Memories may surface without invitation, or simply create a sense of mental movement without clear content. The brain is refining patterns, strengthening some connections and weakening others. This activity is generally quiet, but it still involves awareness, which can delay sleep when the system remains partially engaged. The brain's ability to multitask internally means that rest and processing often overlap. Sleep does not begin the moment processing ends. Instead, processing gradually becomes less conscious, less directed, until awareness fades. When this shift takes longer, it does not indicate a problem. It reflects variability in how much internal organization the brain feels is still needed. There is also the role of expectation. Past experiences shape what the brain anticipates at night. If previous nights involved difficulty sleeping, the brain may come to expect wakefulness. This expectation is not a belief in words. It is a learned pattern. When the environment matches previous conditions, the brain prepares for a similar outcome. Expectation subtly influences alertness. Preparing for wakefulness keeps attention available. This can happen without frustration or fear. Simply noticing that sleep has not yet arrived can reinforce the pattern. The brain responds to noticing by staying engaged. Over time, these layers interact. Prediction, memory processing, expectation, and attention all contribute small amounts of activation. None of them are intense on their own. Together, they can keep the brain hovering near the surface of sleep, present but not fully disengaged. Understanding this complexity can change how nighttime wakefulness is experienced. Rather than a single cause, it becomes a combination of quiet processes unfolding together. The brain is not refusing sleep. It is balancing many signals, waiting for the moment when nothing feels unfinished, unpredictable, or demanding enough to require awareness. Another influence on sleep that often remains invisible is the way the brain interprets time at night. During the day, time is structured by clocks, schedules, and external cues. There is a sense of progression, of moving from one task to the next. At night, that structure dissolves. Time becomes less defined, and the brain loses some of the markers it uses to orient itself. When time feels undefined, the brain may remain alert longer. It relies on cues to decide when to transition between states. Without clear signals, it hesitates. This hesitation does not feel like confusion. It often feels like a quiet waiting, as if the brain is holding position until something confirms that it is safe to disengage. This is one reason routines can be so powerful, even when they are subtle. Repeated sequences signal continuity. They tell the brain that nothing unexpected is about to occur. When routines are inconsistent, the brain remains slightly more watchful, keeping awareness available just in case. Another layer involves the relationship between physical stillness and mental alertness. Stillness removes many sensory cues. Movement, even small movement, gives the brain feedback. When the body becomes still, the brain receives less information. In response, it may increase internal monitoring to compensate. This does not mean movement is required for sleep. It means the brain adapts to changes in sensory input. When input drops suddenly, awareness may rise briefly before settling. For some people, this settling happens quickly. For others, it unfolds more slowly. The environment also plays a role in how the brain evaluates safety. Familiar sounds, predictable lighting, and consistent temperature all contribute to a sense of stability. When these elements change, even slightly, the brain notices. A new sound, a different light source, or a shift in temperature can keep the brain engaged longer than expected. These reactions are not conscious judgments. They are automatic assessments. The brain constantly asks whether conditions remain familiar enough to allow vulnerability. Sleep is a vulnerable state. The brain does not enter it lightly. It is also worth noting that effort to control sleep can alter how time is perceived. When waiting for sleep, time can feel stretched. Minutes feel longer. This altered perception keeps awareness active. The brain monitors the passage of time instead of releasing it. Yet even in these moments, the brain remains responsive to subtle shifts. Awareness does not need to disappear all at once. It fades gradually. The transition into sleep often occurs without being noticed. One moment there is thought, the next there is none. The brain allows this when conditions feel sufficiently stable, predictable, and undemanding. Recognizing how the brain relates to time, stillness, and environment can soften the experience of nighttime wakefulness. The mind is not delaying sleep intentionally. It is navigating a quiet transition, guided by signals that operate beneath awareness. Another quiet process influencing sleep has to do with how the brain handles meaning. During the day, many experiences are absorbed without much reflection. Words are exchanged. Information is taken in. Small emotional signals are registered and set aside. The brain notes them, but does not always assign them a clear place right away. At night, when external input fades, the brain often turns toward this unfinished meaning-making. It reviews what was said, what was implied, and what might still matter. This does not always appear as clear thoughts. Sometimes it is simply a sense of mental activity, a feeling that something is being sorted without conscious involvement. The brain is especially sensitive to ambiguity. Situations that were emotionally neutral but unclear tend to linger. A comment that could be interpreted in multiple ways. An interaction that ended without resolution. These moments do not demand urgent attention during the day, but at night they become more noticeable. Ambiguity signals the brain that understanding is incomplete. An incomplete understanding keeps awareness present. This process is not driven by emotion alone. Even neutral curiosity can maintain wakefulness. Wanting to understand, even quietly, is still a form of engagement. The brain remains gently active as long as it senses that clarity has not yet been reached. Another subtle influence comes from the way the brain separates internal and external safety. During the day, external cues dominate. At night, internal cues become more influential. Sensations, memories, and emotional tones are weighted more heavily because there is less competition from the outside world. This shift can make the inner landscape feel louder than expected. A thought that would barely register during the day can feel prominent at night. The brain is not amplifying it intentionally. It is simply attending to what remains. The mind's tendency to wander at night is often misunderstood as a lack of discipline or control. In reality, wandering attention is a sign that the brain is no longer being directed. Direction requires effort. Effort requires wakefulness. When effort relaxes, attention moves freely until it finds something to settle on. Eventually, for many people, attention settles on nothing in particular. Thoughts lose their coherence, images become less connected. The sense of time softens. This is not something that is done. It is something that happens when the brain no longer detects the need to stay organized. If it takes longer on some nights, that does not mean the process has failed. It simply means the brain is still completing its quiet work, assigning meaning, resolving ambiguity, and gradually releasing awareness when nothing more feels required. Another quiet influence on nighttime wakefulness lies in how the brain responds to responsibility. Responsibility does not always appear as stress or pressure. Often it exists as a low, continuous awareness that something depends on you, even if that something is not immediately present. The brain holds these signals gently during the day, placing them in the background while attention is directed elsewhere. At night, when external demands fall away, these background signals can move closer to awareness. The brain checks them, not urgently but attentively. It asks without words whether anything still requires readiness. This checking can feel like thinking, but it is not deliberate. It is a form of quiet supervision that the brain has learned to maintain. Responsibility is closely tied to predictability. When outcomes are known and roles are clear, the brain relaxes more easily. When outcomes feel open or evolving, even in subtle ways, the brain remains slightly engaged. This engagement does not need to feel heavy. It can exist as a gentle alertness, a sense of being on standby. There is also the influence of anticipation. Anticipation is not the same as worry. It is the brain's way of preparing for transition. Upcoming changes, even small ones, can keep awareness present longer than expected. The brain prefers to remain available when something new is approaching, regardless of whether that change is positive or neutral. This is why nights before events often feel different from ordinary nights. The brain adjusts its state in advance, maintaining flexibility. Sleep may still occur, but it may arrive more gradually, as the brain balances readiness with rest. Another layer involves how the brain interprets silence. Silence removes cues that normally confirm stability. In silence, the brain listens more closely. This does not mean it expects danger. It means it increases sensitivity, just enough to remain informed. Over time, as silence remains unchanged, the brain learns that nothing is required and releases that sensitivity. The release does not happen all at once. Awareness fades in stages. Thoughts become less connected. Sensations lose their sharpness. Time becomes less distinct. The brain does not announce this shift. It simply allows it. When wakefulness lingers, it is often because the brain is still gathering reassurance from the environment, both external and internal. Familiarity, consistency, and the absence of demand gradually provide that reassurance. Once it is received, the brain no longer needs to stay engaged. Seen this way, difficulty sleeping is not opposition. It is attentiveness waiting to be dismissed. And dismissal for the brain comes not from force, but from quiet confirmation that nothing more is required. Another subtle factor that shapes whether the brain releases into sleep is how it responds to internal noise. Internal noise does not mean loud thoughts or strong emotions. It refers to the constant low-level signals coming from the body and nervous system. Heart rhythm, breathing patterns, muscle tone, and small sensory changes are always present, even when they are not consciously noticed. During the day, these signals are mostly filtered out. The brain prioritizes external information and goal-directed activity. At night, when external input decreases, the filtering changes. Internal signals become more noticeable, not because they are stronger, but because there is less competing information. For some people, this shift brings awareness to sensations that were previously ignored. A subtle tension in the jaw, a change in breathing, the feeling of the heartbeat against the chest. The brain notices these sensations and briefly evaluates them. This evaluation is automatic and quiet, but it still involves awareness. The brain's role is not to ignore sensation, but to interpret it. When sensations are familiar and consistent, interpretation happens quickly and fades. When something feels unfamiliar or unpredictable, even mildly, interpretation takes longer. Awareness stays present until the signal is categorized as safe and unimportant. This process can create the impression that the body itself is keeping the mind awake. In reality, the brain is simply recalibrating its attention. Once the internal landscape feels familiar enough, attention naturally loosens again. Another contributor is how the brain responds to contrast between activity and rest. Many people move quickly from stimulation to stillness. The transition can be abrupt, from movement, light, sound, and engagement to darkness, silence, and immobility. The brain does not always shift states at the same speed as the environment. When the change is sudden, the brain may briefly increase alertness to compensate. This is not resistance. It is adjustment. Over time, as the new conditions remain stable, the brain adapts and reduces that alertness on its own. This adjustment period varies from night to night. It is influenced by fatigue, emotion, novelty, and expectation. Some evenings the shift is smooth. Other evenings it unfolds slowly. The brain does not follow a schedule. It responds to signals as they arrive. What often complicates this process is attention to the adjustment itself. Noticing that sleep has not arrived can keep awareness active. The brain interprets noticing as relevance. Relevance sustains monitoring. Monitoring delays disengagement. Yet even then, awareness gradually thins. Thoughts lose structure. Sensations become less defined. The sense of being awake softens without a clear boundary. Sleep does not begin with a moment of decision. It begins when the brain no longer finds anything that requires continued observation. When that moment arrives, it often passes unnoticed. The brain simply releases its hold, not because it was forced to, but because there is nothing left that asks to be held. Another quiet influence on the brain's willingness to sleep is how it evaluates familiarity. Familiarity is one of the strongest signals of safety the brain uses. When things are known, repeated, and predictable, the brain relaxes its need to monitor. When something feels slightly different, even in a neutral way, awareness remains present a little longer. At night, familiarity matters more than during the day. In daylight, novelty is often welcomed. At night, novelty can keep the brain attentive. A different sound outside, a change in lighting, a new sleeping environment, or even a small shift in routine can be enough to delay disengagement. The brain notices these differences automatically without judgment and keeps attention available until they are understood. This process does not feel like fear. It often feels like mild alertness or simple awareness. The brain is not expecting danger. It is waiting for confirmation that nothing unexpected will happen. Once that confirmation is received repeatedly, familiarity builds and awareness begins to soften. There is also the role of internal familiarity. The brain becomes accustomed to certain nighttime patterns. If evenings are usually filled with quiet activity, reflection, or thought, the brain may come to expect that state. When rest is desired but the familiar pattern is thinking, the brain follows what it knows. Familiarity outweighs intention. This does not mean habits are fixed. It means they are learned gradually. The brain adapts based on repetition, not instruction. Over time, even subtle changes can reshape what feels familiar at night. The brain adjusts quietly without needing conscious effort. Another aspect of familiarity involves emotional tone. Even neutral emotional states can become familiar. A certain kind of quiet alertness, a gentle restlessness, or a reflective mood can be learned as part of nighttime experience. When night arrives, the brain prepares for that tone, maintaining awareness just long enough to recreate it. Yet familiarity also works in the opposite direction. When nights repeatedly pass without anything demanding attention, the brain learns that too. It releases vigilance more easily. The learning happens beneath awareness shaped by experience rather than intention. As the night continues, familiarity accumulates moment by moment. Sounds repeat without change. Sensations remain consistent. Thoughts lose urgency. The brain receives the same message again and again. Nothing new is happening. With each repetition, monitoring becomes less necessary. Eventually, the brain no longer needs to keep awareness available. Not because it was convinced, but because the environment, both inside and outside, has proven itself stable enough. When that happens, the transition into sleep occurs naturally, without effort, without instruction, and often without being noticed at all. Another quiet process that influences sleep involves how the brain responds to evaluation. During waking hours, evaluation is constant. The brain assesses progress, effectiveness, relevance, and outcome. This happens so automatically that it often goes unnoticed. At night, when there is nothing left to evaluate externally, this habit does not immediately stop. The brain may continue to assess internally, checking how the day went, what remains undone, or how the current state compares to expectation. This evaluation does not have to be negative. It can be neutral, even subtle, a sense of reviewing, a light awareness of where things stand. Yet evaluation itself keeps the brain engaged because evaluating means observing. Observing means staying present. The difficulty is that sleep requires the opposite. Sleep begins when evaluation fades, when nothing needs to be measured or compared. The brain cannot evaluate its way into rest. It must eventually stop checking altogether. Until it does, awareness remains lightly active. This is why trying to assess sleep itself can keep it away. Wondering how long it will take, whether it is working yet, or how the body feels compared to previous nights, all keep the brain in a monitoring role. Monitoring delays disengagement, even when the intention is rest. Another layer of evaluation comes from internal standards. Many people carry expectations about how sleep should feel, or how quickly it should arrive. These expectations are often learned unconsciously, shaped by past experiences or external advice. When reality does not match expectation, the brain notices the difference. Difference signals relevance. Relevance keeps attention available. The brain is not critical in this process. It is simply comparing patterns. It notices when things deviate from what is familiar or expected and remains alert until the deviation is resolved or understood. Over time, as the night continues without significant change, evaluation loses its purpose. There is nothing new to assess, nothing shifts, and nothing requires comparison. The brain receives the same information repeatedly, and evaluation naturally slows. As evaluation fades, so does the sense of effort. Thoughts become less structured, awareness becomes less focused. The brain stops asking questions and stops waiting for answers. This is not something that is achieved. It is something that happens when the brain no longer detects a reason to remain involved. When this point is reached, sleep does not announce itself. There is no clear moment of transition. Evaluation simply ends, and awareness dissolves quietly as the brain allows itself to move into a state where nothing needs to be watched, measured, or understood any longer. Often, the brain's difficulty with sleep is less about what is happening and more about what might still happen. Awareness lingers when the mind senses possibility. Possibility does not need to be dramatic or urgent. It can exist as a quiet openness, a sense that something could still require attention, even if nothing clearly does. The brain is especially responsive to this state because possibility implies choice, and choice implies readiness. In these moments, the mind may feel gently alert rather than restless. Thoughts move without urgency. Attention remains present without attaching strongly to any single idea. From the inside, this can feel like being awake without effort, simply present. From the brain's perspective, this state is useful. It allows rapid response if something changes, while conserving energy compared to full alertness. This in-between state is familiar to many people at night. The body rests while the mind hovers. It is not resisting sleep. It is waiting for confirmation that waiting is no longer necessary. That confirmation rarely arrives as a clear signal. Instead, it accumulates slowly through sameness. The same silence, the same darkness, the same absence of demand. As this sameness continues, the brain begins to predict stability. Prediction reduces the need for monitoring. Monitoring fades gradually, not all at once. Attention becomes less precise. Thoughts lose their edges. The sense of being present softens without disappearing immediately. Sometimes the brain briefly returns to awareness during this process. A thought surfaces, a sensation is noticed, or time becomes momentarily clear again. This does not reset the process. It is part of it. The brain checks, finds nothing new, and releases once more. Sleep emerges from this repetition. Not because the brain was convinced, but because nothing contradicted rest. Over time, the absence of change becomes the strongest signal of all. Nothing is required. Nothing is expected. Nothing needs to be held. When the brain finally allows sleep, it does so quietly. There is no transition to observe. Awareness thins, then disappears. The process completes itself without instruction, without effort, and without the need to be noticed. As the night deepens, the brain's relationship with awareness continues to soften, even if sleep has not yet arrived. Awareness does not disappear abruptly, it thins. The edges of thought become less defined, and the sense of continuity weakens. The mind may still notice impressions, but they feel less connected, less demanding. This gradual thinning is part of the natural transition, not a delay or disruption. At this stage, the brain is less concerned with meaning and more responsive to rhythm. Repetition becomes reassuring. The same sounds returning without change. The same stillness, holding steady. Rhythm tells the brain that the environment is predictable, and predictability lowers the need for vigilance. Nothing new is introduced, and nothing asks to be followed. Memory activity also shifts during this time. Instead of clear recollection, memory becomes fragmentary. Images or ideas may appear briefly and dissolve before forming a sequence. This is not the mind wandering, it is the brain releasing structure. Structure requires effort. Effort maintains wakefulness. When structure fades, effort fades with it. The sense of time often becomes unreliable here. Minutes no longer feel distinct. The mind may lose track of whether moments are passing quickly or slowly. This loss of temporal clarity is not confusion. It is a sign that the brain is no longer organizing experience in the way it does during waking hours. For some people, awareness briefly sharpens during this process. A moment of clarity appears, followed by another softening. This fluctuation is normal. The brain tests whether monitoring is still needed. When nothing changes, it lets go again. Each release becomes slightly easier than the last. What matters most during this phase is consistency, not effort, not intention, simply the absence of new demands. The brain responds to what remains the same, not to what is wished for. Over time, sameness communicates safety more clearly than any thought ever could. Eventually, awareness becomes too diffuse to sustain itself. Thoughts no longer link together. Sensations lose definition. The sense of being present drifts without direction. Sleep does not begin as an event. It arrives as the quiet absence of awareness, when the brain no longer finds anything worth observing. In these later hours, the brain often becomes more receptive to subtle cues than to conscious intention. Small, consistent signals begin to matter more than deliberate effort. The absence of change continues to communicate stability, and stability slowly reduces the need for awareness. This process does not feel active. It unfolds quietly, without requiring participation. The mind may still register occasional thoughts, but they no longer invite engagement. A sentence may begin and then dissolve. An image may appear without context and fade before meaning forms. This is not distraction. It is the brain loosening its grip on organization. Organization belongs to waking life. As it softens, awareness follows. The body participates in this transition without instruction. Muscle tone eases in places that were unnoticed before. Breathing finds its own rhythm. Sensory boundaries become less clear. These changes are not commands being followed. They are responses to the same message the brain is receiving. Nothing needs to be done. Sometimes the brain briefly checks in with itself during this stage. A flicker of awareness appears, as if asking whether it is still necessary to remain present. When no new information arrives, that question answers itself. Awareness recedes again, slightly more than before. This gradual withdrawal can feel uneven. There may be moments of clarity followed by moments of vagueness. The brain is not reversing progress, it is confirming conditions. Each confirmation makes the next release easier, even if the process is not perceived as linear. Importantly, sleep does not require the complete absence of thought. It begins when thought no longer organizes itself around meaning or outcome. Randomness replaces direction. Continuity gives way to fragments. The mind stops building and starts drifting. When this happens, there is no clear boundary to cross. Awareness simply thins beyond usefulness. The brain does not decide to sleep. It stops deciding altogether. In that absence of decision, rest becomes possible. If the process seems slow on some nights, it is not because something is wrong. It is because the brain moves at the pace required to feel certain. Once certainty is reached, even quietly, awareness releases without ceremony, and sleep arrives without being noticed. As awareness thins, the brain begins to rely less on interpretation and more on simple presence. During waking life, experience is constantly labeled, categorized, and placed into context. At night, that tendency slowly weakens. Sensations are felt without being named. Thoughts pass without being followed. The mind remains open but less engaged. This shift can feel subtle. There is still awareness, but it no longer feels pointed. Attention spreads rather than focusing. The brain is no longer searching for relevance. It is allowing experience to exist without deciding what it means. Meaning requires effort. Letting meaning dissolve reduces the need to stay awake. The nervous system responds to this change by lowering its threshold for disengagement. Signals that once would have triggered attention now pass without response. A sound occurs and fades. A sensation appears and blends into the background. Nothing stands out long enough to be held. This state often feels neither fully awake nor clearly asleep. It is a soft middle ground where awareness exists without direction. The brain remains capable of noticing, but it is no longer compelled to act on what it notices. Readiness gives way to permission. In this space, time becomes especially fluid. Moments no longer connect in a clear sequence. The sense of before and after loses its importance. The brain no longer tracks progression because progression is unnecessary. Nothing is expected to follow. If thoughts appear here, they are often incomplete. A phrase without an ending, an image without context. They do not invite continuation. They simply pass. The brain allows them to dissolve because there is no reason to keep them organized. Eventually, even this loose awareness becomes unnecessary. The brain receives enough confirmation that nothing requires monitoring. The internal environment feels as stable as the external one. When that balance is reached, awareness fades naturally without effort or recognition. Sleep does not arrive as something new. It arrives as the quiet absence of the need to notice anything at all. As the night carries on, the brain's need to make sense of experience continues to diminish. During the day, understanding is essential. The mind connects events, evaluates cause and effect, and keeps track of what belongs where. At night, this function gradually loses importance. Understanding gives way to simple awareness, and even that begins to soften. In this quieter state, the brain becomes less responsive to detail. Precision fades. The difference between one sensation and the next matters less. Sounds may blend together. The boundary between thought and sensation becomes less distinct. This is not confusion. It is the brain relaxing its grip on separation. The sense of self also becomes less defined here. During waking hours, identity is reinforced constantly through action, decision, and response. At night, with no actions required, that reinforcement weakens. The brain no longer needs to maintain a clear narrative of who is doing what. Awareness remains, but without a central point organizing it. This change often feels neutral. There is no sense of loss. There is simply less structure. The mind does not disappear. It becomes diffuse. Thoughts may arise without ownership, as if they belong to no one in particular. Sensations occur without commentary. The brain allows experience to pass without placing itself at the center. This diffusion reduces the need for vigilance. When there is no clear focus, there is nothing to protect or prepare. Readiness dissolves into passivity. The brain no longer scans for relevance, because relevance depends on a defined point of reference. Occasionally, awareness briefly gathers again. A thought becomes clear. A sound stands out. This gathering is temporary. When nothing follows, it disperses on its own. Each dispersal makes the next one easier because the brain learns that re-engagement is unnecessary. Over time, these cycles shorten. Awareness gathers less often and for shorter moments. The spaces between thoughts widen. Sensations feel farther away. The brain does not mark this progression. It simply responds to the absence of demand. Eventually, even diffuse awareness becomes unnecessary. The brain no longer maintains a field of observation. Experience continues without being registered. In that quiet absence of registration, sleep takes hold, not as an action, but as the natural end of attention. As attention continues to loosen, the brain shifts away from monitoring altogether and towards simple continuity. During waking hours, continuity is maintained actively. The mind links one moment to the next, ensuring coherence and direction. At night, that linking becomes unnecessary. Moments no longer need to connect. They can exist independently, without sequence or purpose. In this phase, awareness may feel spacious rather than focused. There is still perception, but it is wide and unfixed. The brain is no longer searching for cues or meanings. It is allowing experience to occur without commentary. This state feels neutral, sometimes almost blank, though not empty in an uncomfortable way. The reduction in monitoring also changes how sensations are experienced. The body remains present, but its signals no longer demand interpretation. A sensation can appear and fade without being labeled as important or unimportant. The brain receives the information and lets it pass because nothing asks to be done with it. This letting pass is central to sleep. Sleep is not the absence of sensation, but the absence of response. The brain allows signals to exist without engaging with them. When response fades, awareness loses its anchor and drifts. The environment contributes quietly to this drift. Repetition continues. Sounds remain the same or do not appear at all. Light stays constant. Temperature does not demand adjustment. Each unchanging moment reinforces the message that no action is required. Occasionally, the brain briefly checks for change. This check is quick and light. When nothing new is detected, monitoring stops again. These checks become less frequent as stability persists. The brain learns through repetition that continued awareness offers no advantage. As this learning settles, the mind no longer holds itself together. Thoughts do not finish. Sensations blur. The sense of being awake loses clarity. There is no need to notice this loss. It happens quietly, without announcement. In this way, sleep arrives, not by replacing wakefulness, but by allowing wakefulness to dissolve. Awareness thins beyond usefulness and then disappears entirely, leaving the brain free to rest without having to decide to do so. As wakefulness loosens further, the brain begins to favor passivity over readiness. During the day, readiness is useful. It keeps perception sharp and responses quick. At night, readiness slowly loses its value. The brain does not abandon it instantly. It lets it fade in small increments, responding to the continued absence of demand. In this stage, attention becomes less selective. Nothing stands out long enough to be held. Sounds may be noticed without direction. Sensations may be felt without edges. Thoughts arise without momentum. The brain is no longer organizing experience into something that needs to be acted upon. What often remains is a simple sense of being present, without focus or intention. This presence does not require effort. It does not require maintenance. It exists briefly and then thins on its own. The brain allows it because nothing challenges it. The sense of continuity weakens even more here. One moment does not clearly lead to the next. Awareness may flicker, then fade, then return briefly without explanation. These fluctuations are not interruptions. They are signs that the brain is disengaging in stages, testing whether continued awareness still serves a purpose. When nothing changes, those tests become unnecessary. The brain stops checking. Attention loses its reference points. The distinction between inner and outer experience softens. Sensations and thoughts blend into the same quiet background. In this space, effort has no place. Trying to guide the process would reintroduce structure, and structure would require monitoring. Instead, the brain responds to the simplest signal available. Nothing is required now. As that message repeats, awareness grows thinner. Thoughts no longer form sequences. Sensations no longer ask to be named. The feeling of being awake becomes vague, then optional, then absent. Sleep does not begin as a new condition. It arrives when the previous condition is no longer maintained. The brain stops holding wakefulness in place, and without being held, it dissolves quietly, leaving rest to occur on its own terms. As the brain moves closer to rest, its relationship with effort becomes almost non-existent. Effort belongs to waking life. It is how the mind shapes experience, directs attention, and maintains order. In the quiet of night, effort gradually loses relevance. The brain no longer tries to influence what is happening. It allows events to unfold without interference. In this phase, awareness feels increasingly soft. It is present, but not pointed at anything in particular. There may be moments where nothing stands out at all, followed by brief impressions that pass before they can take form. The brain is no longer assembling experience into something coherent. Coherence is unnecessary when nothing needs to be done. The sense of location also begins to fade. During the day, awareness is clearly anchored in the body and in the environment. At night, those boundaries loosen. Sensations still occur, but they feel distant, as if happening without a clear center. The brain does not need to maintain a strong sense of position when action is no longer required. This loosening extends to thought. Thoughts may appear as fragments rather than complete ideas, a word without context, a vague image without meaning. They do not invite continuation. The brain allows them to dissolve because following them offers no benefit. At this point, the distinction between noticing and not noticing becomes less clear. Awareness may hover without registering details. The brain remains capable of perception, but perception no longer organizes itself into experience that feels owned or directed. The environment continues to offer the same quiet message. No change, no demand, no need to respond. With each moment that passes unchanged, the brain's confidence in letting go increases. Monitoring becomes unnecessary, then irrelevant. Eventually, awareness becomes too diffuse to sustain itself. There is no clear object to attend to and no reason to keep attending. The brain does not mark this moment. It does not announce a transition. Awareness simply thins beyond usefulness. In that thinning, wakefulness releases itself. Not because it was replaced, but because it was no longer supported. The brain settles into rest quietly, without decision, without observation, and without the need for anything further to happen. As rest draws nearer, the brain's activity becomes less about processing and more about simple continuity. During waking hours, continuity is maintained through active linking, one thought leading to the next, one moment clearly following another. In the quiet of night, that linking weakens. Experiences no longer need to connect. They can appear and fade without sequence. This is often when awareness feels thin but not absent. There may still be a sense of being here, but without direction or focus. The brain is no longer organizing experience into something meaningful. Meaning requires structure, and structure has already begun to dissolve. In this softened state, even the idea of waiting begins to fade. Earlier in the night, the mind may have been aware of waiting for sleep to arrive. Now that sense loses clarity. Time no longer stretches forward. It simply exists, moment by moment, without expectation. The body continues to signal safety in quiet ways. Stillness remains uninterrupted. Sounds, if they occur at all, repeat without variation. Sensations stay familiar. Each repetition reinforces the same message, and with each reinforcement, the brain releases a little more of its hold. Thoughts that appear here are often incomplete. They do not ask to be finished. The brain no longer treats them as invitations. They drift through awareness without direction and dissolve before they can gather momentum. There may be brief moments when awareness sharpens slightly, as if checking whether it is still needed. These moments pass quickly. When nothing new presents itself, the brain lets go again, more easily than before. The intervals of release grow longer. The moments of clarity grow shorter. Eventually, awareness becomes optional. It no longer holds itself in place. The brain does not need to maintain a field of observation when there is nothing left to observe that requires response. Sleep arrives here without being noticed. There is no boundary to cross and no moment to recognize. Awareness simply thins until it is no longer present, leaving the brain free to rest in a state where nothing needs to be monitored, understood, or held together. As awareness continues to fade, the brain's need to define experience weakens even further. During waking life, defining is constant. The mind draws boundaries, separates one sensation from another, and keeps track of what belongs where. In the later hours of night, those boundaries soften. Experience becomes less segmented and more continuous, without clear divisions. In this state, perception no longer feels anchored to a specific point. Sensations arise, but they do not point back to a clear observer. Sounds may be present without seeming close or far. The body is felt, but without sharp outlines. The brain no longer invests energy in locating experience, because location no longer serves a purpose. Thoughts, when they appear, feel distant and incomplete. They may surface as brief impressions, without a beginning or an end. There is no sense of following them. The brain allows them to pass without reaction, because reaction would require re-engagement. This is often when the sense of control disappears almost entirely. Earlier in the night, there may have been subtle attempts to guide the process, to notice progress, or to evaluate wakefulness. Here, even that fades. Control requires attention. Attention has already begun to dissolve. The brain responds to this lack of control not with resistance, but with relief. Without the need to manage experience, awareness can loosen further. The nervous system no longer prepares for response. Muscles remain relaxed without effort. Breathing continues without being noticed. Time loses its last remaining structure in this phase. There is no sense of how long anything lasts. Moments do not accumulate. The idea of before and after becomes irrelevant. The brain no longer tracks duration because duration has no consequence. At this point, wakefulness is no longer actively maintained. It persists only as a faint residue, thinning with each unchanged moment. Nothing reinforces it. Nothing asks for it. Without reinforcement, it fades on its own. Sleep emerges not as an event, but as the quiet absence of awareness. The brain does not enter it deliberately. It simply stops sustaining wakefulness, and in that stopping, rest takes over naturally, without being perceived as something that has begun. As the night settles even further, the brain no longer treats awareness as something that needs to be preserved. Earlier, awareness lingered because it served a purpose, even if that purpose was unclear. Now that usefulness has largely disappeared. The brain does not actively remove awareness, it simply stops supporting it. In this phase, experience feels increasingly distant. Sensations may still arise, but they do so without clarity or definition. A sound might be present without being recognized as a sound. A bodily sensation might exist without being identified as coming from anywhere in particular. The brain allows perception to occur without organizing it into experience that needs attention. Thought becomes sparse here. When it appears, it lacks continuity. A phrase may surface without context, or an image may drift through without meaning. These fragments do not connect. They do not form a narrative. The brain no longer attempts to link them because linking no longer offers value. The sense of effort has fully dissolved by this point. There is no attempt to guide what is happening, no checking, no waiting. Even the idea of letting go has faded. Awareness remains only as a faint background, no longer central to experience. This background awareness thins with each unchanged moment. Nothing reinforces it. The environment remains stable. The internal landscape remains quiet. Without reinforcement, the brain allows awareness to loosen further, the way a muscle relaxes when it is no longer needed. At times, awareness may seem to blink in and out, present for a moment and then gone again. These moments are not interruptions. They are signs that wakefulness is no longer being held continuously. The brain is releasing it in stages without concern for order or timing. Eventually, even this intermittent awareness becomes unnecessary. The brain no longer maintains a field in which experience is registered. Sensations may still occur, but they are not noticed. Thought no longer forms at all. There is no moment to observe when this happens. No boundary is crossed. Wakefulness simply ends because it is no longer sustained. The brain settles into sleep quietly, without effort, without awareness, and without needing to recognize that anything has changed. As the brain remains in this softened state, its relationship with experience becomes almost passive. During the day, experience is something that is taken in, interpreted, and responded to. Here, experience simply occurs without being gathered. The mind does not reach for it, it does not organize it. It allows impressions to arise and fade without involvement. Awareness, if it appears at all, is faint and unstructured. There is no clear sense of observing. Sensations do not stand out long enough to be recognized as separate. The brain no longer distinguishes between what is inside and what is outside with any precision. Boundaries that mattered earlier have lost their function. In this condition, even subtle changes fail to register. A sound may happen without being noticed. A shift in sensation may pass without acknowledgement. The brain has reduced its sensitivity not because it is shutting down, but because heightened sensitivity is no longer useful. The absence of response becomes the dominant pattern. Signals arrive, but nothing follows them. No evaluation, no adjustment, no preparation. The nervous system rests in this lack of reaction, conserving energy without needing to be directed. Thought, when it briefly appears, feels disconnected and incomplete. There is no sense of ownership. It is not clear where the thought came from or where it might go. The brain does not attempt to find out. Curiosity has faded along with intention. This state does not feel dramatic or noticeable. It feels neutral, almost empty, though not uncomfortable. The mind is no longer occupied, but it is also no longer engaged in noticing its own absence. Awareness has become optional, then unnecessary. As this continues, wakefulness loses its final supports. There is nothing left to sustain it. The brain does not resist this loss. It does not need to. Without purpose, wakefulness dissolves on its own. Sleep settles in without transition or marker. There is no sense of arrival. Awareness simply ceases to be present, and the brain rests in a state where nothing is observed, nothing is interpreted, and nothing is required to happen. As this quiet state continues, the brain no longer differentiates clearly between moments. Earlier, there was still a sense of sequence, even if it was faint. Now, sequence itself begins to dissolve. One impression does not lead to the next. Experience exists without order, without direction, and without any need to connect what comes before with what comes after. In this phase, awareness is no longer something that happens continuously. It appears briefly, then disappears for stretches of time that are not measured or noticed. When it returns, it does so softly, without clarity, and without a sense of continuity from before. The brain is no longer maintaining a steady field of observation. The body remains present, but its signals are muted. Sensations arise without sharpness. There is no urge to adjust, no impulse to respond. The brain has received enough confirmation that stillness can be maintained safely. It no longer prepares for movement or reaction. Thought is almost entirely absent here. When fragments appear, they lack language or structure. They feel more like traces than ideas. The brain does not recognize them as thoughts worth holding. Without recognition, they pass immediately, leaving no impression behind. Time, at this point, has lost all practical meaning. There is no sense of duration. The brain no longer tracks how long anything lasts because nothing requires timing. Without timing, there is no waiting. Without waiting, there is no anticipation. What remains is a very thin layer of presence, barely sustained. It does not observe itself. It does not reflect. It simply exists until it no longer needs to. The brain allows this layer to fade because maintaining it offers no advantage. Eventually, even this minimal presence is released. There is no awareness of release. There is no sense of transition. Wakefulness is not replaced by sleep. It simply stops being supported. In that absence of support, the brain rests fully. Nothing is monitored, nothing is processed, nothing is anticipated. Sleep takes over quietly, without being perceived as something that has begun. In this deepening quiet, the brain's activity becomes almost entirely non-directed. Earlier in the night, there was still some orientation, a faint sense of being present within experience. Now, even that orientation weakens. Awareness no longer has a center. There is no clear point from which sensations or thoughts are registered. Experience happens without reference. The brain does not resist this loss of orientation. Orientation is useful for action, and action is no longer required. Without the need to act, the brain conserves energy by allowing awareness to disperse. What remains is a diffuse background, barely distinguishable from absence. Sensations continue to occur at a basic level, but they are not assembled into experience. A sound may exist without being identified as sound. A bodily signal may arise without being felt as coming from the body. The brain allows these signals to pass through without assigning them meaning or relevance. Thought has almost completely dissolved by this point. There are no longer fragments or impressions that resemble ideas. The mental space that once held planning, memory, and evaluation is now largely empty. The brain has no reason to populate it. Time has fully lost its structure here. There is no sense of passing moments, no awareness of duration. The brain does not track time when there is nothing to anticipate and nothing to respond to. Time becomes irrelevant to experience. What little remains of wakefulness is unsupported. It does not renew itself. It does not gather strength. With each unchanged moment, it fades further, until there is no longer anything left to fade. Sleep does not arrive as something added. It is what remains when wakefulness has completely withdrawn. The brain rests without awareness, without monitoring, and without the need to recognize that rest has begun. At this depth of quiet, the brain no longer distinguishes clearly between rest and awareness. Earlier in the night, wakefulness softened gradually. Now, even the idea of being awake has little meaning. There is no contrast left to maintain it. Awareness does not disappear suddenly. It simply becomes unnecessary. Experience at this point feels almost empty of features. Sensations do not stand out. Thoughts do not form. The brain does not register absence as something to be noticed. It no longer checks whether anything is happening. Checking itself would require structure, and structure has already dissolved. The nervous system rests in a state of minimal activity. Signals continue to move through it, but they do not reach awareness. There is no interpretation, no response, no preparation. The brain has received all the reassurance it needs. Stability has been confirmed repeatedly without interruption. If awareness flickers here, it does so faintly and without continuity. There is no sense of returning to anything, no recognition of where it came from or where it might go. These brief flickers do not reestablish wakefulness. They fade before they can gather form. In this state, even the sense of letting go no longer applies. Letting go implies intention. Intention is absent. The brain is not releasing awareness actively, it is simply no longer sustaining it. What is not sustained disappears on its own. Time has no presence here. There is no waiting, no progression, no sense of how long anything lasts. The brain does not measure when nothing depends on measurement. Duration becomes meaningless. Sleep settles fully without boundary or marker. There is no moment to recognize, no transition to observe. Awareness ends quietly, and the brain remains at rest in a state where nothing is perceived, nothing is evaluated, and nothing needs to be held together. In this extended stillness, the brain no longer maintains any active relationship with experience. Earlier phases involved softening, thinning, and dispersing. Here, even those processes have completed themselves. What remains is not a state that feels empty or full, but one that no longer refers back to awareness at all. Signals continue to exist at a biological level, but they do not rise into experience. The brain does not translate them into sensation, thought, or perception. There is no need to interpret what is happening when nothing requires interpretation. The system rests in a condition of minimal engagement, conserving energy without effort. The sense of separation between inner and outer has fully dissolved. There is no inside to monitor and no outside to respond to. This does not feel like a loss. There is no perspective left from which loss could be noticed. The brain is simply no longer constructing experience in a way that includes awareness. Any remaining traces of wakefulness are unsupported. They do not renew themselves, they do not organize. Without support, they fade naturally the way a sound fades when it is no longer sustained. Nothing replaces them. There is no transition to something else. The absence of structure is complete here. No sequence, no duration, no orientation. The brain does not track, predict, or evaluate. Those functions belong to waking life and have already been set aside. Sleep, in this sense, is not entered. It is what remains when all the conditions that require wakefulness are no longer present. The brain rests without awareness, without monitoring, and without the need to recognize rest as something distinct. If awareness were to return later, it would do so as a new process, built again from signals and structure. For now, there is nothing being built. The brain remains settled, quiet, and inactive in the way it is meant to be when nothing at all is required. In this settled state, there is no longer a sense of progression toward anything. Earlier, the night unfolded through subtle changes, but here even change has lost relevance. The brain is not moving toward rest. It is already resting without needing to represent that rest to itself. Awareness is no longer a reference point. What continues at a basic level is simple biological continuity. Systems maintain themselves quietly, without signaling. There is no checking, no adjustment, no interpretation. The brain does not need to confirm that it is safe. That confirmation is already accumulated through countless unchanged moments. If fragments of awareness appear at all, they do so without form. They do not resemble thought, sensation, or perception in the usual sense. They do not linger. They do not connect. They pass without leaving any trace behind. The brain does not respond to them because response would require re-engagement. The absence of engagement becomes stable here. Nothing interrupts it. Nothing competes with it. The nervous system remains in a low-energy state, conserving resources without effort. There is no tension to release, because nothing is being held. The idea of an observer has disappeared. There is no sense of watching or experiencing. Experience continues only at levels that do not rise into awareness. The brain no longer constructs a field in which things appear. Without that field, there is nothing to notice. Time has no meaning in this condition. There is no duration to measure and no moment to distinguish from another. The brain does not track time when nothing depends on it. Time dissolves along with awareness. This is not a special state and not an achieved one. It is simply what happens when all the processes that maintain wakefulness have withdrawn. Nothing replaces them. Nothing needs to. The brain remains here quiet and undisturbed until conditions change again. For now, there is no change, no demand, and no reason for awareness to return. In this ongoing quiet, the brain no longer organizes experience around presence or absence. Earlier distinctions have dissolved so completely that they no longer register. There is no sense of being aware and no sense of not being aware. Those concepts belong to a stage that has already passed. Biological processes continue steadily beneath this silence. They do not announce themselves. They do not require attention. The brain maintains balance without translating that activity into experience. Nothing needs to be noticed for the system to function. If any trace of perception arises, it does so without definition. It does not form an object. It does not attach to a location. It leaves no memory behind. The brain does not recognize it as something occurring because recognition itself would require a return to structure. There is no monitoring here, Monitoring depends on the possibility of change, and change is not being evaluated. The environment remains constant. The internal landscape remains constant. With nothing shifting, the brain has no reason to reopen awareness. The absence of awareness does not feel like emptiness. Feeling requires perception. What exists instead is neutrality without reference. The brain is not experiencing rest. It is resting. Time does not pass in this condition in any meaningful way. Without awareness, there is no sequence of moments. There is simply continuity without duration. The brain does not register how long this state lasts, because nothing depends on length. This state remains until conditions alter naturally. A change in light, a sound, a bodily signal strong enough to matter. Until then, the brain remains settled, conserving energy, disengaged from observation and undisturbed by the need to respond. Nothing needs to happen next. Nothing is expected. The system rests in the absence of demand, unchanged and unoccupied, exactly as it does when sleep has fully taken hold. In this sustained quiet, the brain no longer maintains a relationship with experience that could be described as awareness. Earlier phases involved gradual release, thinning attention, and fading structure. Here, those processes have already completed. What remains is not something that can be observed, because observation itself has ended. The systems that keep the body alive continue to function smoothly, without signaling upward into consciousness. Regulation happens automatically. Balance is maintained without feedback. The brain does not need to check on these processes, because they have proven reliable over countless repetitions. There is no internal commentary here, no background sense of being present, no reference point from which anything could be noticed. The absence of awareness is not registered as absence. Registration would require a frame, and the frame has dissolved. If a stimulus were to appear, it would need sufficient strength or novelty to rebuild structure. Until then, nothing assembles. Signals pass through lower levels of processing and fade without reaching experience. The brain remains disengaged, conserving energy without effort. The idea of depth or duration has no meaning in this state. Without awareness, there is no measure of time and no sense of continuity. Nothing accumulates. Nothing progresses. The brain does not move through this state. It simply remains. This condition is not fragile. It does not need protection or maintenance. The brain is not holding it in place. It is simply no longer holding wakefulness. What is not held does not persist as experience. Rest continues here without recognition. There is no moment to mark and no change to observe. The brain remains settled, inactive in the ways that matter for awareness, and fully disengaged from the need to monitor, interpret, or respond. Only when conditions shift enough to require attention will awareness gradually reassemble. Until then, nothing interrupts this quiet absence. The brain remains at rest, undisturbed, and unconcerned with the passage of anything at all. In this prolonged stillness, nothing inside the brain is trying to move experience forward. Earlier in the night, there was at least a faint sense of transition, a gradual unfolding from one state into another. Here, even that sense has vanished. There is no direction left to follow, because nothing is expected to follow from anything else. The brain remains active only in the most basic automatic ways. Regulation continues quietly. Balance is maintained. These processes do not rise into awareness, and they do not need to. They operate beneath the level where experience forms, carrying on without interruption or notice. There is no longer a sense of context. Experiences are not placed anywhere because there is no framework left to place them in. Without context, perception cannot take shape. Without shape, there is nothing to register. The brain does not attempt to create structure when structure is unnecessary. If awareness were to return briefly at this stage, it would have no continuity. It would not feel like returning to something familiar. It would appear without reference and disappear again without trace. These moments do not rebuild wakefulness. They dissolve before they can organize. Time remains without meaning here. There is no awareness of duration, no sense of waiting, no anticipation of what comes next. The brain does not track time when nothing depends on it. Sequence has no function, so it is not maintained. This absence of structure is not fragile. It does not require silence, darkness, or perfect conditions to continue. It persists because nothing challenges it. The brain has settled into a state where monitoring offers no benefit, and so monitoring has stopped. Rest in this form is not experienced as rest. Experience itself is absent. The brain is not aware of being disengaged. It simply is disengaged, conserving energy without reference or commentary. Only when a signal strong enough to matter appears will the brain begin to rebuild awareness. Until that happens, there is no reason for anything to change. The system remains quiet, undisturbed, and inactive in the ways that belong to wakefulness. In this quiet continuation, the brain no longer treats the absence of awareness as something that needs explanation. Earlier, awareness faded through recognizable stages. Now even the idea of stages has dissolved. There is no longer a sense of movement through states, because movement implies direction, and direction is no longer relevant. The processes that remain active are those that never required awareness in the first place. Breathing continues. Circulation continues. Balance is maintained. The brain does not observe these processes, and it does not need to. They unfold reliably without being brought into experience. Nothing here feels still or active, because feeling itself has lost its reference. Without awareness, there is no contrast by which anything could be labeled. The brain is not registering calm or rest. It is simply not registering. If signals arise at lower levels of processing, they remain there. They are filtered before they can assemble into sensation or thought. The brain no longer opens the pathways that would translate signal into experience. Without those pathways, awareness cannot form. This condition persists without effort. It does not depend on maintaining silence or stillness. It continues because nothing disrupts it. The brain does not guard this state. Guarding would require vigilance, and vigilance has already been set aside. Time remains absent from experience. There is no sense of how long this continues because nothing is being tracked. The brain does not accumulate moments. It does not notice their passing. Duration has no relevance when nothing depends on it. There is no observer here to recognize absence or presence. The idea of an observer belonged to wakefulness. With wakefulness withdrawn, observation is no longer constructed. What remains cannot be described from the inside because there is no inside perspective left. The brain stays in this condition until something external or internal requires attention again. Until then, nothing assembles, nothing changes. The system remains disengaged, conserving energy, and undisturbed by the need to respond or to know that it is responding. In this sustained absence of demand, the brain no longer maintains any internal reference points. Earlier, there were still faint outlines of experience, traces of sensation or thought that could briefly appear. Here, even those outlines are no longer formed. There is nothing for awareness to attach to, and nothing that asks for attachment. The systems that support life continue their quiet work without interruption. They do not communicate upward into experience, because there is no experience being constructed. Regulation occurs without feedback. Stability is maintained without monitoring. The brain trusts these processes because they have proven reliable beyond the need for observation. There is no sense of background or foreground. Those distinctions require awareness to define them. Without awareness, there is no hierarchy of experience, no center and no periphery. Signals may exist at lower levels, but they are not translated into anything that could be noticed. If a stimulus were to appear with enough strength, the brain would rebuild structure gradually, step by step. Until then, structure remains unnecessary. The brain does not hold space open for awareness. It closes that space naturally when nothing calls for it. Time has no presence here. There is no sequence of moments and no duration to register. The brain does not move through this condition. It simply remains unchanged because nothing introduces change. This state does not require maintenance. It is not preserved intentionally. It continues because the conditions that sustain wakefulness are absent. Without those conditions, wakefulness does not arise. Nothing about this needs to be recognized. Recognition would require awareness, and awareness is not present. The brain rests in a state that is complete in itself, undisturbed, and free from the need to observe or interpret anything at all. Only when the environment or the body introduces a signal strong enough to matter will the brain begin slowly and quietly to assemble awareness again. Until that moment, there is no reason for anything to shift. The system remains settled, silent, and at rest. In this continued quiet, the brain remains disengaged from anything that would normally create experience. Earlier, there were descriptions that could still be formed from the outside, ways of pointing toward what was happening. Here, even description becomes unnecessary. Nothing inside the system is organizing itself into something that could be noticed. Biological activity continues without interruption. Neural patterns cycle quietly. Regulation remains steady. These processes do not announce themselves and do not need oversight. The brain no longer allocates resources to monitoring because monitoring serves no purpose when nothing is changing. There is no sense of space or position. Sensations do not gather into locations. The body is not experienced as separate from anything else. Without awareness, separation is not constructed. The brain allows signals to remain unbound, passing through without forming experience. The absence of thought is complete. Not even fragments appear. Language has no foothold here. Images do not form. Memory does not activate. The systems that support these functions remain idle because there is nothing for them to work on. Time does not exist in this condition. There is no awareness to mark its passing. No moment replaces another. The brain does not move forward or backward. It simply continues in a stable, inactive relationship with experience. This state is not maintained deliberately. The brain is not holding itself here. It remains only because the conditions that would reassemble awareness have not appeared. Without stimulation that requires response, the system stays disengaged. Nothing about this needs to resolve or complete itself. There is no endpoint to reach. The brain is already resting fully without reference to rest or wakefulness. Only when change returns will awareness slowly rebuild, beginning again with faint signals and structure. Until then, the system remains exactly as it is, settled, quiet, and undisturbed, with nothing to notice and no reason for anything to happen. In this long stretch of stillness, the brain no longer treats change as something to be anticipated. Anticipation belonged to earlier stages, when awareness was still lightly present and the possibility of response remained. Here, even that possibility has faded. There's no readiness being maintained, because readiness has no role to play. The processes that continue do so without signaling upward. Regulation remains steady and automatic. Balance is preserved without correction. The brain does not supervise these functions, because supervision would require a return to awareness. What continues does so quietly, without needing to be known. There is no internal scene here, no backdrop against which experience might appear. Sensory input, if it exists at all, does not assemble into sensation. Thought does not gather. Memory does not stir. The pathways that would normally translate activity into experience remain inactive. The absence of experience is not experienced as absence. That distinction requires an observer, and no observer is present. The brain is not aware of resting. It is resting without reference, without commentary, and without the need to recognize rest as a condition. Time remains without meaning. There is no sense of duration, no feeling of continuation, no marker of passing moments. The brain does not register time when nothing depends on sequence or timing. Continuity exists without measure. This condition persists effortlessly. It does not depend on perfect silence or complete stillness. It continues because nothing introduces demand. Without demand, the systems that support wakefulness remain inactive. When change eventually occurs, awareness will not return all at once. It will rebuild gradually, from the simplest signals upward. Until that moment arrives, there is nothing to rebuild and nothing to attend to. For now, the brain remains settled, disengaged from experience, conserving energy in the most complete way it knows how, undisturbed by the need to notice, interpret, or respond to anything at all. In this sustained quiet, the brain does not return to earlier patterns unless something genuinely asks for it. Earlier phases involved gradual easing, then release, then the absence of structure. Here, even the memory of structure has no function. Nothing inside the system is waiting to resume or to respond. Physiological rhythms continue evenly, without drawing attention to themselves. There is no signal asking to be interpreted, no fluctuation that requires adjustment. The brain no longer prepares for response because response has no relevance in the absence of demand. Stability maintains itself quietly. There is no inner landscape to survey, no sensations forming a map, no thoughts arranging themselves into sequences. Without awareness, these elements do not gather. They remain unassembled, passing through lower levels of processing without rising into experience. The idea of rest does not appear here. Rest is not perceived or evaluated. It is simply the condition that exists when wakefulness is not sustained. The brain is not aware of being at rest, just as it is not aware of not being awake. Awareness itself has withdrawn. Time does not return in this state. There is no sense of duration or continuity. Moments do not replace one another. The brain does not count or notice passage when nothing depends on it. continuity exists without reference. This condition is resilient because it is undemanding. It does not require silence to continue. It does not require darkness. It persists as long as no signal strong enough to matter appears. The brain remains disengaged because engagement would offer no advantage. If awareness were to rebuild later, it would do so gradually, starting with faint signals that ask for interpretation. Until then, nothing assembles. Nothing shifts. The system remains settled, conserving energy without awareness, without monitoring, and without the need to recognize that anything is happening at all. In this continued absence of demand, nothing inside the brain reaches outward for orientation. Earlier in the night, there were still faint traces of alignment, a sense that something might need to be tracked or held. Here, that orientation has no role. There is no reference point left from which awareness could be constructed. The systems that remain active do so quietly and automatically. They do not request attention, and attention does not seek them. Regulation continues without supervision. Balance is preserved without evaluation. The brain does not monitor what has already proven stable. There is no experience of silence or stillness, because experience itself is not being formed. Sensory activity, if present, does not become sensation. Neural activity does not become thought. Memory does not surface. The pathways that would translate activity into awareness remain unused. The absence of awareness does not feel like absence. Feeling would require a perspective, and no perspective is being maintained. The brain is not aware of disengagement. It is simply disengaged without the need to know that it is. Time remains without presence. There is no duration to sense and no sequence to follow. Nothing marks a beginning or an end. The brain does not track continuity when nothing depends on progression. This state persists because it is complete. It does not need to be defended or maintained. It continues until something meaningful enough appears to require reassembly of awareness. Until that point, nothing changes. When change eventually arrives, awareness will not appear fully formed. It will return gradually, building structure only as needed. For now, there is no need for structure, no need for response, and no need for observation. The brain remains settled in this quiet neutrality, conserving energy in the absence of demand, undisturbed by the passage of anything, and free from the necessity to notice or interpret what is not asking to be known. In this extended calm, the brain no longer relates to experience as something that unfolds. Earlier, there were still faint echoes of unfolding, a sense that one moment followed another. Here, even that echo has faded. Nothing progresses, nothing concludes. The idea of sequence has lost its function. Physiological activity continues at a steady, unremarkable level. Systems regulate themselves without signaling for oversight. There is no internal check-in, no background scan. The brain does not look for confirmation because confirmation has already been established through uninterrupted sameness. There is no internal point of view from which anything could be noticed. Sensory input, if present, does not coalesce into sensation. Neural patterns do not assemble into thought. Memory does not activate. Without a point of view, these processes remain beneath experience, functioning without becoming known. The absence of awareness is not perceived as absence. Perception itself is no longer constructed. There is no sense of being disconnected or disengaged. Those descriptions belong to a stage where awareness was still present enough to describe itself. That stage has passed. Time has no relevance here. There is no awareness to register duration, no continuity to follow. The brain does not count or mark moments when nothing depends on timing. Continuity exists only as biological persistence, not as experience. This condition does not need protection. It does not depend on maintaining quiet or stillness. It remains because nothing interrupts it. The brain is not guarding rest. It has simply stopped supporting wakefulness. If awareness were to reappear later, it would do so only in response to a signal that matters. Until such a signal arises, there is no reason for anything to assemble. The system remains exactly as it is, settled and undisturbed. For now, the brain continues in this state without reference, without observation, and without the need to recognize that anything is happening at all. In this sustained neutrality, nothing inside the brain attempts to return to structure. Earlier structure dissolved gradually, leaving softer and softer traces behind. Here, even those traces are no longer relevant. There is no sense that anything has been lost, because loss requires comparison, and comparison no longer occurs. The processes that continue are those that function entirely without awareness. Regulation remains steady. Balance is maintained. These activities do not rise into experience, and the brain does not check on them. They continue because they are designed to do so without instruction or observation. There is no internal landscape forming here. No sensations gather into shapes. No thoughts assemble into fragments. Neural activity remains diffuse and unorganized from the perspective of experience. Without organization, there is nothing to notice and nothing to follow. The idea of rest does not appear. Rest is not recognized as a condition. The brain is not aware of resting, just as it is not aware of not being awake. Awareness itself is no longer being produced, and without awareness, there is no framework for recognition. Time remains absent. There is no duration to sense, no moment to mark. The brain does not register continuity when nothing depends on it. There is no before or after, only uninterrupted biological persistence without experience. This condition continues effortlessly. It does not require silence or darkness to hold. It remains because nothing challenges it. The brain is not maintaining disengagement. Disengagement simply persists in the absence of demand. When a signal eventually appears that requires response, awareness will begin to assemble again, slowly and in stages. Until then, nothing assembles. Nothing shifts. The system remains settled, conserving energy without awareness, without monitoring, and without the need to recognize that anything at all is happening. In this continuing quiet, there is no longer any sense of suspension or pause. Earlier, awareness might have felt as if it were hovering, neither fully present nor fully gone. Now even that hovering has ended. The brain is no longer holding itself in any intermediate state. It is simply not constructing experience. The systems that remain active do so without variability that would matter. Rhythms repeat steadily. Regulation remains balanced. There is no internal signal suggesting that adjustment is needed. Without variation, there is nothing to notice, and without noticing, awareness has no reason to form. There is no background field here in which experience could appear, no space for sensations to arise into. Neural activity continues, but it does not gather into perception, thought, or memory. The pathways that would normally translate activity into experience remain quiet. The absence of experience does not register as silence or darkness. Those are perceptions, and perception is no longer assembled. What exists instead cannot be described from within because description requires awareness. The brain rests without reference, without commentary, and without a sense of itself as resting. Time has no foothold in this condition. There is no sense of duration or flow. Moments do not accumulate or pass. The brain does not mark continuity when nothing depends on sequence. Continuity exists only as ongoing biological function, not as experience. This state is not fragile and not maintained deliberately. It continues because there is no reason for it to end. Wakefulness is not being suppressed. It is simply not being produced. Without production, it does not appear. Only when a signal arises that requires interpretation will the brain begin to rebuild structure again, slowly and incrementally. Until then, there is nothing to rebuild and nothing to attend to. For now, the brain remains settled, disengaged from experience, conserving energy in the most complete way it knows, undisturbed by awareness and unconcerned with the passage of anything at all. Even in a mind that feels quiet, the brain is never completely absent. It keeps the body balanced in ways that do not need attention, adjusting without calling awareness back. And because these adjustments are subtle, they can happen without interrupting rest. The brain knows how to do this. It has been doing it for as long as there have been sleeping bodies to protect. In the background of sleep, there is a steady pattern of cycling. The brain does not stay in one uniform depth all night. It moves through stages, sometimes lighter, sometimes deeper, in a slow rhythm. During lighter moments, the brain may be closer to the surface of awareness. This is when a small sound might be noticed, or a sensation might briefly register, without fully waking you. Then, as conditions remain stable, the brain can settle again. These cycles are normal, and they are part of what makes sleep resilient. Sleep does not require perfect stillness from beginning to end. It allows small fluctuations, small returns to light awareness, and then a return to quiet. The brain is designed to do this because the world is not always perfectly silent, and the body is not always perfectly still. Rest remains possible even with gentle variation. When people feel that they are awake for long stretches at night, it is often because the lighter moments are remembered while the deeper ones are not. The brain records wakefulness more easily than it records sleep. A few brief periods of awareness can create the impression of a night spent mostly awake, even when sleep has been present in between. This is also why checking for sleep can be misleading. If the mind looks for proof that sleep is happening, it brings itself closer to the surface. Proof requires awareness. Awareness changes the very state it is trying to measure. Over time, the simplest way the brain returns to rest is by losing interest in measurement, allowing the night to be what it is without requiring confirmation. If wakefulness appears again, it can be approached as a passing phase rather than a problem to solve. The brain can drift back down when the environment remains unchanged. Silence repeats. Darkness stays steady. The body remains still enough. With each unchanging moment, the brain receives the same quiet message, and that message slowly does its work. In this way, sleep is less like a single event and more like a tide. It comes in, it eases back slightly, and it returns again. The brain does not demand a perfectly straight descent into unconsciousness. It allows softness, it allows small ripples of awareness, and it allows return. For some minds, The ripples are more noticeable. Sensitivity, curiosity, and a habit of reflection can make the surface feel easier to reach. Yet even then, the same principle applies. The brain does not need to be pushed downward. It needs to find again and again that nothing is being asked of it. No new task, no new decision, no new signal that matters. As the night continues, the brain becomes more willing to accept that message. It learns it not from a single thought, but from repetition. The repetition of quiet, the repetition of sameness, the repetition of nothing happening. That is the language the nervous system understands most clearly. And when that language is spoken long enough, awareness begins to thin again. Not because it is forced, but because it is no longer useful. Thought becomes less organized. Sensation becomes less defined. The mind stops holding on to the idea of being awake, and the night continues without needing to be tracked. There can be comfort in remembering that this is a built-in design rather than a personal failing. The brain is cautious by nature, but it is also capable of settling. Given steady conditions, it returns to rest in its own time, quietly, without the need for anything to be solved. As the night moves on, the brain relies less on explanation and more on familiarity. By now, the environment has proven itself steady. The same darkness holds, the same quiet remains, the same absence of demand repeats without interruption. This repetition carries more weight than any conscious reassurance ever could. It is through sameness that the nervous system recognizes safety most clearly. In these later hours, the boundary between light awareness and deeper rest becomes less defined. The brain no longer treats brief returns of awareness as something that needs interpretation. A moment of noticing may arise and pass without forming a story. There is no evaluation of whether sleep is happening correctly. That concern belongs to an earlier stage. Here, interest has faded. The mind may still produce faint impressions, but they lack coherence. They do not connect into thoughts, and they do not invite response. They dissolve before they can take shape. The brain allows this because nothing is gained by holding them. Holding requires effort, and effort has already lost its purpose. The sense of the body also becomes quieter. Sensations blend into a general background without edges. There is no impulse to adjust or respond. The brain no longer checks posture or position unless something truly requires it. Stillness has been confirmed enough times to feel reliable. Time continues to lose relevance. There is no awareness of how long the night has lasted or how much remains. The brain no longer measures progression. Without goals or expectations, there is nothing to measure against. The night simply continues on its own. What remains is a gentle stability that does not need to be maintained. The brain is not holding this state in place. It persists because there is no reason for it to change. Wakefulness is no longer being reinforced, and without reinforcement, it continues to fade. Sleep in this context is not a destination reached at the end of effort. It is the natural condition that appears when vigilance has nothing left to respond to. The brain settles there quietly, without needing to recognize that it has done so, allowing the night to pass without awareness and without demand. In these final stretches of the night, the brain no longer approaches rest as a process. Earlier, there were shifts, softening, gradual changes that could still be described. Now even description becomes unnecessary. The nervous system has settled into a pattern that no longer needs to be named or understood. It simply continues. Any remaining traces of awareness are diffuse and unstructured. They do not gather into thoughts or sensations that ask to be followed. If something registers briefly, it fades before it can be recognized as important. The brain does not engage because engagement offers no advantage in an environment that has proven itself stable again and again. The body remains quietly regulated. Breathing continues without variation that matters. Muscles remain relaxed enough to require no adjustment. Signals move through the nervous system without reaching awareness. The brain allows this because nothing calls for response. Silence and stillness have repeated themselves long enough to become unquestioned. At this point, even the idea of sleep has no presence. There is no sense of approaching it or maintaining it. The brain is not aware of resting. It is resting. Awareness has withdrawn to the point where there is no frame left in which rest could be noticed. Time is no longer part of experience. There is no sense of how long this has lasted or how long it will continue. The night is not tracked. It unfolds without being recorded. The brain does not measure what does not need to be measured. If awareness were to return briefly, it would do so lightly, without pulling the system back into full wakefulness. A moment might surface and disappear without consequence. The brain no longer reacts to such moments. It releases them as easily as they arrive. This ease is not something that has been achieved. It is something that has been allowed through repetition and sameness. Nothing new has happened, and that has been enough. The brain has learned, again, that nothing is required. As the night continues in this way, there is no need for direction, no need for understanding, and no need for effort. The mind remains unoccupied, and the body remains supported by processes that know how to continue without supervision. Rest persists quietly without being noticed, exactly as it is meant to. As the night carries on in this settled way, there is no longer any sense of effort in either direction. Earlier, the mind may have noticed changes, shifts, or transitions. Now, even those impressions have faded. The brain is no longer adjusting or releasing. It has already done so, and nothing further is required. The quiet that remains is not something the brain is maintaining. It exists because there is no reason for it to be disturbed. Internal systems continue their steady work without drawing attention to themselves. Balance is preserved without monitoring. Regulation unfolds without oversight. These processes do not need awareness to function, and so awareness stays absent. If a faint impression appears, it does not gather weight. It does not pull the mind back into focus. There is no sense of returning to wakefulness. The brain has learned that such impressions pass on their own when nothing follows them. With no consequence attached, they dissolve without effort. There is no longer a meaningful distinction between deeper and lighter states here. Those distinctions depend on awareness being present enough to compare. Without comparison, there is simply continuity. The brain rests in that continuity without needing to define it. Time remains irrelevant. There is no sense of how long this state has lasted or how much remains. The brain does not track duration when nothing depends on timing. The night moves on without being registered. This condition does not feel like anything from the inside, because there is no inside perspective left. Experience is not being assembled. There is no observer to note calm or stillness. The brain rests without reference, without commentary, and without the need to recognize rest as something occurring. As long as the environment remains unchanged, Nothing invites awareness to return. Silence stays steady. Darkness holds. The body remains supported. With each unchanged moment, the absence of demand continues to reinforce itself. In this way, rest persists on its own, not as a goal that has been reached, but as the natural outcome of a brain that no longer finds anything worth holding in attention, allowing the night to pass without being noticed at all. As this quiet stretch continues, there is very little left for the brain to interpret or respond to. Earlier in the night, rest arrived through gradual changes that could still be sensed. Now those changes have settled into a steady absence of demand. The brain is no longer adjusting itself to conditions. The conditions have proven themselves stable enough to require nothing further. Any remaining activity stays well below the surface of awareness. Signals move through the nervous system, but they do not assemble into anything that could be noticed. The brain does not lift them into experience because there is no reason to do so. Awareness is not being withheld. It is simply no longer produced. The idea of drifting no longer applies. Here, drifting implies movement. At this point, there is no movement to describe. There is only continuity without direction. The brain is not moving towards sleep or away from wakefulness. It has already settled into a state where those distinctions no longer matter. If something were to register briefly, it would do so without consequence. There would be no evaluation, no follow-up, no attempt to understand or respond. The brain has learned that nothing depends on reaction right now. With nothing depending on it, reaction does not arise. The environment continues to offer the same quiet confirmation. No new sound, no change in light, no signal that matters. The body remains supported without adjustment. Each unchanged moment reinforces the same message, and that message no longer needs to be interpreted consciously to be effective. Time remains absent from experience. There is no sense of passing, no awareness of duration. The night is not something that is happening to the brain. It is simply happening without being registered. In this state, the brain rests in the most complete way it knows how. Not by effort, not by intention, and not by instruction. Rest continues because nothing interrupts it and nothing asks for awareness to return. As this quiet continuity holds, there is nothing left to follow, nothing left to understand, and nothing left to do. The brain remains settled, allowing the night to continue without observation, without commentary, and without the need for anything further to unfold. As the night continues in this settled way, there is no longer any meaningful distinction between resting and not resting. Earlier, the mind might have sensed changes, noticed depth, or wondered where it was within the night. Now those reference points have faded. The brain is no longer orienting itself. It is no longer checking. It is no longer waiting. What remains is simple continuity without awareness. Biological processes continue quietly, doing what they have always done without supervision. Nothing rises into experience. Nothing asks to be named or followed. The brain does not need to conserve effort here, because effort has already disappeared. If awareness were to surface briefly, it would do so without context and without consequence. There would be no recognition of returning, no concern about leaving again. The brain no longer assigns meaning to these brief appearances. Without meaning, they dissolve immediately. The environment remains unchanged, and that sameness has been enough. Silence repeats. Darkness holds. Stillness continues. These are not conditions being evaluated. They are conditions that have already been accepted. The nervous system no longer looks for confirmation, because confirmation has accumulated naturally over time. Time itself has lost relevance. There is no sense of duration, no awareness of passing moments. The night is not something being experienced. It is simply unfolding without being registered. The brain does not follow it. It does not track it. It does not need to. At this point, there is nothing left for explanation to reach. Understanding has done its work and stepped aside. What remains does not require words, concepts, or attention. The mind is no longer occupied, and the brain no longer sustains wakefulness. And if you are still listening, there is nothing more that needs to be said or followed. The night can continue on its own, quietly, without explanation. Wherever awareness is now, it does not need to go anywhere else. Sleep well,